Welcome back to the Tom's Hardware Show. Sorry about that. I didn't have my mic on. Say hello if you're watching in the comments, and let me know if the mic levels sound okay. Always a little tricky figuring out how things sound because I'm just sitting here listening to myself talk. Anyway, I'm Jared Walton with Tom's Hardware, and we are going to talk about Spider-Man Remastered today. Also going to talk a bit about the GPU market and situation, but we're mostly going to talk about Spider-Man performance and what you can expect from the game. So, got any questions? Want to know how a specific GPU works? You can feel free to hit me up with questions in the comments. I will not be testing every GPU under the sun. I tested about 10 graphics cards representing everything from the top of the line Nvidia and AMD solutions down to the GTX 1050 and RX 550 and also Intel integrated graphics. I sort of tested that. We'll get to that later. Let's go ahead and start with the high level overview. This is the system requirements or recommended requirements from Sony, and you can see for minimum performance at 720p and 30 FPS, they're saying very low preset, which is pretty much minimum. I guess you can toggle anti-aliasing on or off separate from that. That's about the only thing you could do to make it lighter. All you need is an Nvidia GTX 950 or AMD equivalent. AMD equivalent would probably be the RX 560. And I did test with an RX 550, one step down from that. Actually, RX 550, as we'll see in a little bit, worked okay. Recommended 1080p medium at 60 frames per second. Big step up to the GTX 1060 6GB and the RX 580. Those are both, 6 years old, something like that. And well within reach, I think, of most people. Because, like the GTX 1060, that's about the performance of a GTX 1650, give or take. I think the 1650 Super is faster. I'd have to double check my numbers, but it's pretty close to that. Very high, 4K, 60 frames per second. This is maxed out quality, except without ray tracing enabled. And they're saying an RTX 3070 or an RX 6800 XT. Now, those are not comparable graphics cards in my book. The RX 6800 XT is normally quite a bit faster than the RTX 3070. It's on par with the 3080, but I don't know if this is officially an Nvidia promoted game, but it feels like it, as we'll see in the benchmarks. And then ray tracing, you've got amazing ray tracing and ultimate ray tracing. They actually changed the ray tracing settings right before launch. So there's no longer a very high or high ray tracing preset. Instead, you can set the ray tracing reflection resolution, the geometry detail, and then the distance of the ray tracing reflections. All of those are now separate. And if you max them out, it's actually higher than it was before. Whereas if you want the equivalent of the old very high preset, I think it's a view distance of maybe 6. Anyway, that's it for the system specs, and let's go ahead and move on to the settings. So, cool thing about Spider-Man, maybe I'll show my face here. You've got upscaling modes. You've got AMD FSR 2.0, the temporal upscaling solution, which is better, quite a bit better than FSR 1.0 in my opinion. It's not perfect. There are some anomalies you encounter every now and then, but in my view, it doesn't really distract most of the time. It's just one of those things where, the movement vectors, I think, are the big thing, where if the movement vectors that are passed to the algorithms aren't computed properly, maybe is the right way of phrasing it, then you can get some oddities. Also, it does like a sharpening pass, and so sometimes I noticed with FSR 2.0 on, there's smoke and other transparent things, and sometimes those look a little wonky with the FSR 2.0. Also supports DLSS. I don't know which version off the top of my head. 2.3. Actually, I'll tell you. I think I can find that out. Got to go over to my other PC here. Let's see, it is Steam apps. All right. Let's see, the Nvidia nvngx.dlss is the file, and it says it is version 2.4.12.0. So there you go. That's as new as I've seen. I haven't really paid close attention to DLSS variants, but that should have all the stuff to eliminate ghosting and basically be as good as possible. All right, let's go ahead and move on from the display options. Oh, also, you can see this in the description. It supports Insomniac Games Temporal Injection, a different form of upscaling. It feels to me like it's maybe on par with FSR 1.0, maybe even worse than FSR 1.0, but it is lighter weight than either DLSS or FSR 2.0, and so, you know, might be worth considering if you have low-end hardware and need some upscaling. Otherwise, I'd stick to FSR 2.0 or DLSS if you've got an RTX card. All right, graphics settings. Yeah, so this is the minimum quality settings. Actually, let's start here. So this is, it says very low, but that actually does set everything to minimum. Texture quality, texture filtering, those both actually have a modest impact on visuals, as you probably would expect. Like if you set texture quality from very high down to low, you'll see some blurriness in the textures. Same with texture filtering. If you're on trilinear instead of, like, I'd say you don't necessarily need maxed out and anisotropic 16x, but if you're at 4x, then you get more clarity on oblique angled textures, meaning like if a texture faces the camera or the screen directly, you don't get too much distortion, but if it's at an angle like on a road, then you can get some distortion, and anisotropic filtering corrects that. Shadow quality, not super critical. Like it didn't impact performance that much. It was one of the heaviest impacting settings besides ray tracing, but it was still only like 5% on AMD and 3% on Nvidia. I'll get to those in a little bit. Ambient occlusion, that actually was a bigger impact. There's a new mode, HBAO Plus, that's horizon-based ambient occlusion, whereas the original shipping version in 2018 on consoles only used screen space ambient occlusion. So we'll look at that in a second. Actually, I might not have included screenshots of that. Basically, SSAO puts shadows under everything, even if they're in the shadows already. All right. Someone's asking, Sammy Sniper, can GTX 660 run it? It needs DX12, so I'm worried about it. Yeah, that DX12 requirement might eliminate some older GPUs like the GTX 660. I think. I didn't actually test it. I'd have to check back. I'll try and update the article, which you can find here on Tom's Hardware. I'll post that in the comments. I will try and update that after the show is over. I will plug in a 660 or something in the 600 series. I'll also plug in a 700 series just to verify, but I'm pretty sure you do need a GTX 900 or newer Nvidia card. On the AMD side, I think HD 7000 and newer probably. So you can go back quite a ways. Those are like 2013 era, 2014 era GPUs, but you can't go further because you need DX12 support. Here's the maxed out settings. So you can see how those change. Very high does not max out your shadow quality or your level of detail or anisotropic filtering. Those are all one notch down. Honestly, doesn't make any difference that I could see in visuals or performance. Like, it's a 2% difference in performance. So, oh, I can hide Sammy's comment. All right, and here's the rest of the things. One thing I do want to note here, chromatic aberration. I hate it. Like it just looks ugly because it blurs like the outside edge circle of your screen. It's supposed to make it look more realistic, but it's like all the image fidelity that you're trying to get with high resolution textures and such out the window. It just loses it. And so I would recommend turning that off personally. Same with motion blur. That's a personal taste. Some people dislike it, but that's it. All right. So I want to show image quality screenshots here before we get into the benchmark results. This is maxed out settings, everything cranked to the highest supported level, and with ray tracing also fully enabled. And what you'll notice here, like on the side of the right side, you'll see the Osborne re-elect banner or sign that's mirrored properly. You'll see other hints of things being reflected, and they're kind of blurry. They're not like perfectly reflected. I think that's a stylistic choice because most reflections aren't perfect, and it's more computational intensive to make them look perfect. But it's a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but there are a lot of reflective surfaces, water on the ground, lots of windowed buildings. And so like if you've got ray tracing hardware, it's nice to be able to enable it, and you do see a difference. Here is the same view without ray tracing, and screen space reflections tries to approximate what things would be reflected. But I mean, like, let me flip back and forth between this again. This is correct ray tracing reflections, or at least more correct. And then this is screen space, and you can see like there's these trees on the left that are reflected in the windows on the right that are totally blown out of proportion on the reflection. It's like, no, that's not how those would reflect. Same with the banners or digital signs further into the scene. Like, you can see there's a little bit of digital signage that you can't really make out, but it's there. You switch and it's like, oh, there's these big white blobs. Maybe part of the Osborne sign is visible. Is it the end of the world? No. Does it hurt performance to turn on ray tracing? Yes. We'll get to that later. It's not unplayable though. Like, most decent ray tracing enabled cards will handle Spider-Man with ray tracing. So, all right, very high. This is high. So if you look, I'm going to toggle back and forth between those. You'll see all these shadows appear under the cards and under Spider-Man 2. And the thing is, he's not in sunlight, and it's not a fully lit, realistic lighting, global illumination world. So there should be some shadowing. The cars do look like they're floating a bit here. You turn on, you drop to high preset, and all of a sudden they get the shadows, and you're like, well, wait, doesn't that actually look better in some ways? Yeah, kind of. The difference is ambient occlusion. So this is horizon-based ambient occlusion, which is supposed to be more accurate, and this is screen space ambient occlusion, which is less computationally intensive, less accurate. It's more of a personal choice, I think. Like, I don't mind the shadows being there. I just, it's funny, like, I think there should be some shadowing from HBAO+, but there isn't. Anyway, sorry. From high to medium, I'm flipping back and forth. The main thing I notice is, like, a little bit of foliage on the trees gets removed. Sorry. Crowd density, I don't think really changes. Everything else, like, it's so close that you go, wait, what's really changing between high and medium? And the answer is not much. Medium to low, again, not a whole lot of change. If you were looking at these without using a compressed YouTube or Twitch or whatever stream, there is a slight loss in texture detail going from medium to low preset, but it's not massive. You can totally play the game on low and still enjoy it. And then we go to the very low preset. The main difference you'll see there is ambient occlusion is fully disabled. So you lose some of the shadowing on like the curb edge and a bit underneath the vehicles. It's funny to me, like very low in some ways still looks better on the shadows than the very high, because like I think the cars should have some shadows even though they're not in direct sunlight. Anyway, that is it for the image quality. I think I wanted to sorry, I was looking at something else. Okay, got a comment from Samed Sul. I have a GTX 750 Ti and he can run it. So 700 series technically does have DX12 support, but it's not like the higher feature levels, so sometimes it's hit and miss. I know Far Cry 6 will not run on GTX 700 series, but we have at least one person saying you can run it on a GTX 700 series. 600 series is also Kepler hardware, so theoretically it should also work, but officially it's not in the list, so go figure. All right, here's a look at the settings performance of impact. So everything in gray is within 3% of the baseline, and since I'm doing a fraps, well, not fraps, I'm using OCAT to capture frame times, so basically it's not 100% reliable because you're manually running it. I'm swinging through the city. There's minor variations between runs. I'd say margin of error is like maybe 2%, and then, you know, honestly you won't really notice anything less than 3%. Certainly, actually I'd say you wouldn't notice anything less than about 10%. But anyway, how's that look? So this is all at 1080p. The baseline 148 frames per second, dropping from the maxed out settings without ray tracing to very high, improved performance like less than 2%. High improves it a couple of percent, medium another couple percent. By the time you're at very low, so going from maxed out settings without ray tracing to minimum quality still without ray tracing, on the RTX 3070 it only gained about 17% in performance. I think that's because it's hitting CPU limits though. So if I were doing that test at 1440p, it would show a bigger gap. Notice the ray tracing reflections at the bottom though in red. That's less than half of the performance by maxing out ray tracing settings. So that'll be painful. Deadman Nasser asks, how's the performance on a 3070 in 4K without ray tracing? I will get to that slide in a little bit, so hang tight. This is the 3070 scaling. Let's cruise over to 6750 XT. Now, the 3070 and the 6750 XT are normally, in most games, about the same performance. I think the 3070 is like 3% faster in my GPU benchmarks hierarchy. In this game, you can see there's a pretty big difference. Like, it gets 30% slower or something like that, 25% slower. So a noticeable drop in performance. Again, is that because it's an Nvidia optimized title, or maybe it's because I used the 22.7.1 AMD drivers, which are not game ready for Spider-Man, whereas on Nvidia they are the 516.94 drivers, something like that. They came out on Monday, and those are game ready. And so maybe the drivers will help AMD a bit. Maybe it just needs a little bit more tuning, or maybe it's because it's heavily Nvidia optimized. Anyway, other than the lower starting point, you know, ray tracing cuts performance in half, but that's only on maxed out ray tracing. If you do like medium or a lesser degree of ray tracing, the impact is lower. All right, done with the initial stuff. Let's talk performance. 1080p medium, this is a good baseline for, you know, it looks good enough. It's still fun to play. You can see just about everything I tested got well over 60 frames per second. Someone asked about a 1650 Ti. You'll see that, well, there's that's a laptop part, so a little different, but I did test a 1650 Super, and I got over 60 frames per second on that. The RX 6500 XT is the slowest GPU I tested for this shot, and it still got 52 frames per second, barely staying above 30 on the 1% minimum frame time or frame rate. At the top end, 3090 Ti, 3070, they're basically running in CPU limits because the 3090 Ti should be a lot faster. 6950 XT also hitting CPU limits, but at a lower degree than the Nvidia cards. And then we just go down the list. So that's fine. This is not minimum quality, but it's a good starting point. Let's go ahead and check minimum quality. So I only tested a few GPUs here. We got the GTX 1050. That is also basically as fast as a GTX 950, which is their minimum recommended GPU. And you can see that it easily clears 30 frames per second at 720p. It also clears it at 1080p, although minimums do drop below 30. A slower AMD card, the RX 550, still playable at 720p. So I would say the RX 550 is going to be down there in like the the GTX 660 range in terms of performance. So you can probably still play it if it's compatible. I don't know. Did I have any stuttering issues when rotating the camera or moving around the city? On these low-end GPUs, the ones that are falling below 30 frames per second on their minimums, a little bit of stuttering. Like it wasn't horrible, but it was a little noticeable. Like you could tell it was dropping below 30. Once you're above like the GTX 1050 at 720p, I didn't feel like there was any stuttering at all. But I was testing on a very high-end CPU with 32 gig of RAM and all that stuff. Is a Core i9 12900K. So the CPU is like way more than most people have or need for gaming. But it does remove CPU bottlenecks as much as possible. Otherwise, like if we go back to the 1080p slide here, like they're already crunched up on the top with similar performance, and so if I had a CPU that was slower, then everything starts to look the same until you get to higher resolutions. All right, the one thing I want to point out here, Intel Iris Xe. This is on a Tiger Lake Core i7 1165 G7. So the fastest Tiger Lake graphics, also similar to the Alder Lake integrated graphics. They're the XELP graphics, and it got like 6 frames per second, totally unplayable. And it's worse than that because like 6 frames per second is bad enough, but let me show you how the game looked. That's on Intel's integrated graphics. There's a black hidden Spider-Man in the middle of the screen that you can barely make out his head. This is what it looks like on an RX 550, or basically any AMD or Nvidia GPU that I checked. The lighting is just totally not working. I've seen this in other games. Intel has driver problems. They still have driver problems. They're trying to create discrete graphics cards and they still have driver problems. So this is not a good thing. But hopefully they get better. And this is a DirectX 12 game, so there's stuff about like DirectX 11 requires more driver work from Intel for Arc to run well. That theoretically isn't the case with Spider-Man Remastered, and yet it still totally doesn't render properly. So hopefully Intel can fix their drivers and maybe boost performance to where it would be playable. Even like with upscaling enabled, I did the ultra performance upscaling. It looked horrible, super blurry and messy, and it still only got 6 or 7 frames per second. So it's hitting some other bottleneck right now, and the drivers are basically broken for Intel. So be warned. All right, 1080p maxed out settings. So this is like very high, but with anisotropic filtering and shadow quality and level of detail are turned up to their maximum, which is one step further. Doesn't make a difference really in performance. We get a little bit more separation than at 1080p medium. The 3070 is still beating his 6950 XT, which normally shouldn't happen, but because of Nvidia optimizations or AMD drivers or whatever. You know, AMD's underperforming a bit here. RTX 2060 still doing 90 frames per second. RX 6600 doing 84 frames per second. Those are comparable graphics cards in terms of pricing right now. Like the 2060 is actually faster than the 3050, and you can find it on EVGA, I think, for $250 or $240. I saw it on sale briefly for $220 over the weekend. So that's actually a really nice graphics card if you could get it for $220. Anyway, 1650 Super, still pulling nearly 60 frames per second, but struggling a little bit. 6500 XT, definitely struggling at 38 frames per second with minimums of 26 frames. So that's about as far as you'd want to go with an RX 6500 XT, or that's similar to, you know, some other cards like what's the previous generation? I mean, it's actually slower than an RX 5500 XT, so you could probably get by with a little bit more. Crank up the resolution. 1440p, no ray tracing still. The 3090 Ti is still cruising along. I mean, let me go back and forth just to show, like, it lost 3 frames per second because it's still hitting CPU limits, whereas the 3070 went from 149 down to 111. So that's more in line with what you would expect to happen if you're not CPU limited, if you're graphics limited. You can see the 6950 XT now moves ahead of the 3070. That's kind of expected in games that are GPU limited, so we're getting GPU limited now. The 6600 moves ahead of the 2060 a little bit. You could, you know, DLSS versus FSR might change that. And then I dropped the 6500 XT because it was too slow at 1440p, but the 1650 Super, surprisingly, is still playable. And then someone asks, hey, how does the 3070 run in 4K without ray tracing? There you go. Almost 60 frames per second. And if you enable DLSS quality mode, it would get you above 60 frames per second. So, 1650 Super I dropped because it was down into the teens. 2060 only getting 29 frames per second. I should note that I believe I did check DLSS on the 2060 with 4K, and it gets like 45 frames per second. It's almost like a 50% boost to performance at 4K. So, you know, if you are okay with DLSS, and I think it looks fine, you know, you could add another 50% to the bottom of the list there. That takes care of the standard performance testing. Still got more stuff to go through though. Let's talk ray tracing. So this is medium settings with medium ray tracing. Their ray traced reflections used to have settings of medium, high, or very high. They changed that on Monday. So I had pre-release code, and they patched it twice. I didn't do any testing before Monday because like they released 3 patches since I got access to the game. But medium DXR is kind of like you use the high quality reflections and the high geometry for ray tracing, and then you set the distance to, I think, probably around 4. So the distance slider for ray traced reflections it goes from 1 to 10. So I think medium is probably around 4, maybe. Outside of the 6500 XT, everything is playable, and everything from 2060 and above is very playable, breaking 60 frames per second. Again, DLSS, FSR would boost that even more. So I think I tested the 6500 XT with FSR 2.0, and let me see if I actually got those numbers. Yeah, I think it was right close to 30. Probably still questionable. Probably wouldn't do it, but in theory you could. And there's a trade-off using medium quality with medium reflections versus like a higher quality without ray tracing. If you've got a slower card, even if you have ray tracing hardware, I would probably go to at least the high quality settings before I turned on ray tracing. All right, maxed settings with ray tracing. The 6500 XT fell apart. Like, it wasn't just unplayable, it was like single digits, so I could drop that. But everything else remained mostly playable. 6600 struggles a little bit. In normal ray tracing games, it's closer to the 2060 than it is in Spider-Man. So again, driver updates from AMD could improve the situation. 6950 XT, it's a maybe 20% drop from the 3090 Ti. 3070 is beating the 6750 XT by 20% almost as well. But without upscaling, most of these cards are still playable, and upscaling technologies would help. 1440p, more of the same. The 2060 is now pretty much unplayable without DLSS. Everything else is playable. And then at 4K maxed out settings, without upscaling, nothing can hit 60 frames per second, not even the 3090 Ti. So, we just got to get the Ada Lovelace, the RTX 4090, which hopefully will come out in the next month or two. I keep saying that. I suspect September is a good time frame for the launch, but Ada may or may not come out in September. So that's everything on standard performance, and then I limited my testing for upscaling to only 2 cards. I only tested the 3070 and the 6750 just because you've got 3 upscaling modes for Nvidia. You've got DLSS, you've got FSR 2.0, and then you've got the Insomniac Games temporal injection that you could test with. And I did test with all 3 of those in quality mode, but I didn't want to repeat all of those tests on all the other cards, so keep that in mind. All right, let's go back to the slides. So here's upscaling. You got 4 options, native plus the 3 upscaling solutions on Nvidia. You can see performance didn't actually change on any of those, and that's because there's some, like the bottleneck I showed earlier, it looked to be around 160, but with ray tracing enabled, either there's more CPU workload to be done or something else is holding it back. But basically the 3070 can't get past 120 frames per second with ray tracing enabled and the various upscaling modes. The AMD RX 6750 XT, meanwhile, it's sitting down around 100 frames per second. I mean, it's a little bit faster with FSR 2.0, but maybe that was just margin of error. 1% down on FSR, 1% up on, or 1% up on FSR, 1% down on the others. Anyway, basically these cards at 1080p medium with ray tracing were not showing any upscaling benefits, so you need to go to a higher quality mode. So this is maxed out settings, but now still with quality upscaling modes. And now you can see that the 3070 was doing 72 frames per second, and it bumps up into the 92 to 95 range, depending on your upscaling solution. iGTI does perform a little faster, but it looks worse. So I wouldn't recommend iGTI necessarily. I would much rather have DLSS. FSR 2.0 is close to DLSS, but I think DLSS has the edge in overall quality, which, if you don't have an RTX card and you need a little boost of performance, then use FSR2. You can also enable dynamic upscaling, where you set a target frame rate of like 60. I'm not sure what the game supports. I know there's 30, 60. I can't remember if there was other values that you could set it to, but I tested without dynamic upscaling as well. The 6750 XT got about, what is that, like a 20-25% boost in performance with the upscaling. So both of those became playable at 1080p with ray tracing and maxed out settings. So that's kind of what you're looking for. Did that change? No. Okay, 1440p. Now we see more of a separation between the algorithms. Interestingly here, FSR 2.0 performed better than DLSS. iGTI still looks worse, and so it's easier to run. On AMD, iGTI, again, a little bit faster than the FSR 2.0, but it's not as big of a gap as on the 3070. Kind of interesting. And then finally, we've got maxed out 4K with ray tracing. And DLSS, you can see, actually this time beats FSR 2.0. So I don't know why that happens, but it was slower on DLSS at 1440p, faster at 4K. And this is all using maximum quality upscaling as well. So, you know, you could drop the mode to balanced or even performance, especially at 4K, and still get a relatively decent looking image. What do I got left? Oh, that's it, man. Right? Yeah. That's all I got for you. The article on Tom's Hardware does have some other stuff that I forgot to put in my slide deck here. So one of the things that it shows is image quality looking at the 3 upscaling solutions. You can check that out, and you can see, you know, basically you'll notice that in quality mode at 1080p, there's a clear loss in quality on the iGTI upscaling. If you push it to performance mode, there's a clear loss in quality on DLSS and FSR2 and iGTI. But if you were running at 4K, performance mode might not look as bad. Anyway, that's about all I've got to say about Spider-Man. Any questions on Spider-Man, throw them in the chat now. I just wanted to talk about a couple other things that are interesting of late. So I already mentioned, like, the RTX 2060 is on sale now at EVGA and some other places too. I think it's $250 on Amazon and Newegg, I believe I saw this past week. To me, it feels like EVGA has inventory to get rid of as soon as possible. They're an Nvidia premier partner, like they get all the latest stuff from Nvidia maybe a little bit before some of the others. So when EVGA is unloading previous gen graphics cards and current gen as well, dropped in price. I mean, EVGA had a 3090 Ti that was down to $1,150 or $1,100. Still expensive, yes, but that was, you know, a $2,000 card at launch, and not surprisingly, with the drop in cryptocurrency values, they can't maintain those prices, and so they're clearing house. And it's not just the RTX 2060. I mean, if you go to EVGA right now, I want to say, let me see what's in stock. So 3080 for $770, still above MSRP. Well, Nvidia's MSRP, but it's getting better. 12 gigabyte 3070. I thought I saw one, or 3080. Did I see one of those? Maybe not. Maybe those are sold out now. $600 for 3070. That's still not a great deal. 3070 Ti 660 or 680, not a great deal. But then you get down to, yeah, it looks like the 3090 Ti's have mostly sold out. The ones that were going for $1,150. But the 2060 12 gigabyte is $280. The 12 gigabyte version. So that's actually pretty cool, because that was supposed to be, like, people called it a mining card. It was just a really weird thing. But 12 gigabytes removes, like, one of the major handicaps that the 2060 has, where on certain settings you go beyond what it's able to make use of in terms of in terms of VRAM. You'll exceed your VRAM and you'll tank performance. So the fact that you can get the 12 gigabyte cards from EVGA for, I think the 6 gigabyte cards are selling for, where is it? $230, $250. So basically you're only paying anywhere from $20 to $40 extra to move up to their 12 gigabyte model. If you want a 2060, I would do that. Keep in mind, 2060 is faster than a 3050. So like the 3050s are still going for generally above $300, at least the last I looked. And so I would not recommend buying a 3050, especially at the prices that they're selling for, because the 2060 is a faster card, and with 12 gigabytes of memory, it's definitely a better card. 3060, meanwhile, like that's definitely faster than a 2060, but those are going for $400 and up. So I think, well, it looks like there's a PNY on Amazon for $385, which to me that still feels like too much. But let's go. So RTX 2060, good deal. Everything else on the RTX side, still a little expensive, but prices are coming down. On the AMD side, the RX 6600 is a great card. It's usually faster than the 2060, Spider-Man results notwithstanding. Like, if you're looking at non-ray tracing performance, the 6600 is faster. I think it's 20% faster than a 2060. You know, it hangs, it's pretty close to the RTX 3060, if I remember right. And it's really cheap. Like the 6600 these days is going for like $250 is what I remember seeing it on sale for this past week. Looks like $260 right now is the starting price. So that's a really attractive card for the price and performance it's now offering. MSRP was maybe too high at $330 at launch, but it's come down a lot since then. And yeah, so 6600 is about the same performance as an RTX 2070, faster than an RTX 2060 Super. You know, so keep that in mind if that's what you're after. It is slower than the 3060 by maybe 5%, 4%. No, 10%. Right? No. I got to do math in my head. It's about 5% slower, yes. 5 or 6% slower. All right. So keep your eye out if you're looking for a good mid-range card. Right now, top picks got to be the 2060 and the 6600. 6600 XT isn't bad. It's just a little bit more expensive. Like, instead of paying $250 or $260, they're going for, the cheapest ones are about $300, but they also quickly get up into the like $350 to $400 range. I would not pay $400 for a 6600 these days. 6650 is supposed to be a $400 card, is the official MSRP. It's selling for $360 now, so it's below MSRP. That's a pretty decent card as well. It's right about the level of an RTX 2080, or a little bit slower than an RTX 3060 Ti. The 3060 Ti, meanwhile, it costs almost $500. So there's that. Nvidia's like mainstream GPUs are still too expensive. GTX 16 series is also coming down in price. I think EVGA has a lot of those in stock, but the 2060 is just like it's 20% faster, I think, than a GTX 1660 Super, and it's basically the same price now, or pretty dang close to it. I think it's like $20 extra for a big jump in performance. So I would strongly recommend a 2060 over a 1660 Super if you're looking for something affordable. Okay, I think that does it. Right now we're waiting for RDNA 3 and RTX 40 series to launch. Those are probably both still a month away for Nvidia, probably 2 or 3 months away for AMD, and they'll probably launch at the high end. So if you're looking for a good $300 graphics card, $400 graphics card, I don't think you'll see anything radically change in that area this year. You'll have to wait for 2023. At the high end, though, I'd be very, very careful about investing in any of the like 3080, 3080 Ti, 6900, all of those cards. Like, their prices have come down a lot, but it's also they're coming down because they know they're about ready to be discontinued and replaced by faster, better hardware. Speaking of which, latest leaks say power draw on the RTX 4080 and 4070 is supposed to be substantially lower than some of the earlier leaks were saying. So 4080, some were saying it would be a 450 watt card. Now they're saying it will be the same as the 3080 Founders Edition, 320 watt. And the 4070 has dropped down to like 285 watt. Those are rumors, but I think those are probably a lot more likely than the 450 watt 4080 rumors we were seeing. We still might see 600 watt 4090 Ti or Titan or whatever it ends up being called, some maxed out crazy GPU with dual 16 pin power connectors, and it will probably also cost a lot. Like if Nvidia brings back the Titan branding, your top of the line Ada card will probably shoot up to like $2,500 again, like the Titan RTX, and then they'll have a 4090 that will maybe be $1,500 and would look like a deal by comparison. Anyway, I don't see any questions here. I think that about does it for this week. Got a long weekend ahead of me. Gonna take off. Thanks, future. Gonna go camping. So hope you guys have a good last few weeks of summer wherever you are, or winter if you're in the southern hemisphere, I guess. I'm gonna go camping. We'll see y'all next time, and I don't honestly even know what we'll talk about, but we'll see you then.